Hey everybody, Brittany here, and welcome to a new video. Today we're going to be looking at one of my favorite games of all time. This is Benjamin Gledura versus Vishwanathan Anand, the ex-world champion. And why is this game so interesting to me? Well, first off, it's an ending, and your boy loves endings. But also, it's an unconventional ending, and I think that's really important to take a deeper look at, because sometimes when you're trying to learn, you learn all these things about how, you know, a bishop's better than a knight if there's both sides, pawns on both sides of the board, or, you know, like a rook is better than a bishop. But sometimes there's cases where these things aren't true. And well, the first thing I mentioned, a knight being better or knight being worse than a bishop, is something that's going to pop up in this game. So let's get to that position, but let's also talk about the other stuff that happened in this game too, because I think it's quite interesting. d4, d5, c4, c6, and now we have the semi-Slav defense. This is one of my favorite positions to play as black. Maybe I shouldn't reveal my prep to you guys, but I love you guys so much that I just have to. So knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, and e6. This is the traditional semi-Slav. It's like a triangle system, almost. You can think of it almost like a reverse London system. That's kind of what the semi-Slav is, except you keep your bishop on c8. It's a very good system. So here, I love the systems with bishop to g5. This is something that can lead into something called the Cambridge Springs after knight bd7, e3, and queen to a5. And so many complications, but it's a really cool variation. I do recommend checking it out. Maybe I'll make a video on it if you guys would like. But today we're looking at the Moran, and the Moran is with an early e3 instead, leaving this bishop on c1. Normally it will go to b2 if it can. And knight bd7 was played, which is the another traditional move here. Bishop e7 is also fine. Queen to c2, bishop to d6, and bishop to d3. Castles, castles. And we see an interesting move here from Anand, the move e5. However, that's not the only move in the position. There's also d takes c4. Why is this a move? It feels weird because you're worsening your control over the center whenever you take with a central pawn and take a flank pawn, right? When we look at this d pawn, it's attacking c4 and e4. And when it takes and you capture back, well, now you're not controlling those two squares of the pawn anymore. But there's a big reason why. So b5 to attack the bishop moves away. Not really important exactly where it moves, but after the bishop moves away, you have the move bishop to b7. You can follow up with a move a6, which is important because it protects the b5 pawn. And you can go for a move c5. And as we can see, a lot of the pieces in this position and in this game control the e4 square. This is one of the biggest ideas of the semi-Slav for both sides. Control the e4 square. Can white play e4, or can black control the square and put a piece on it? But of course, this isn't what happened in the game, because that's not the only thing you can do. Sometimes you go for the e5 break, and that's what happened here. So after e5, we see c takes d5, c takes d5, and an immediate e4, which is, to me, a very interesting position because all of these pawns are attacking each other in the center. There's a central pawn on, well, every single one of the squares in the center there. So e takes d4, knight takes d5, knight takes d5, and e takes d5. And what we're going to see here is white goes up a pawn, but doesn't keep it. And this is actually a very important thing to remember. Sometimes it's a lesson that people need to know. So h6 is forced, not necessarily forced. I don't want to say that. There is knight to g5, or f6, but bishop to g5, creating a pin and renewing the threat of bishop to h7 is not really something you would necessarily want to allow. But h6 is my preference as well, and I think it might even be forced, but that's not important because this isn't a theory lesson. So knight takes d4, and as we can see, yeah, now white is up a pawn. It doesn't stay that way, and it's quite interesting how they give it back. So queen h4, threatening mate, forces knight f3, queen h5, and there's this really cool move by Gledura here. It's the move bishop to h7. Now, when I saw this move originally, it didn't make sense, because this looks like a really stupid move. It's like, okay, congrats, you got a check. Patzer sees the check, Patzer plays a check, right? But this guy's a grandmaster. He knows what he's doing, and spoiler alert, he does beat Anand in this game. And the big reason behind this is you want to trade queens, and after king to h8, the king is worse prepared for the endgame. That's a very deep idea, and that made, well, just a big impression on me overall. So queen f5 was played here, and after queen takes f5 and bishop takes f5, again, now it's an ending, which was kind of forced after queen f5. There's not really a way for the queen to escape there. We have an ending where the king is worse placed, and we're going to see a lot of that in this game, where white's pieces are just slightly better than black's, and that just leads into a significant advantage by the end of the game. Knight to f6, bishop takes, and rook f takes. It feels more natural to play rook a takes, and I would probably just play that in a game because then you can still bring your f rook in, but Anand played rook f takes. And after rook to d1, rook goes back to d8, and bishop to e3. And after bishop to e7, we see that there's just no way to defend this pawn. That's not a big deal though, because Gledura finds a way to give the pawn back, but gaining a little tiny edge from it. And that's with the move d6. This is another move that made a big impression on me. This is the second of, I'd say, the 3 or 4 moves. d6 is interesting because, well, for example, if bishop takes, now there's this move rook d4, and you can double up on the d file and get a little bit more activity. Or, as we can see, after rook takes, Gledura decides to play rook takes on d6, bishop takes, and now rook to d1. And again, when we compare all the pieces after bishop c7, this bishop's attacking the pawn. It feels a little bit more active than theirs, but let's just say for the sake of the argument that they're roughly even. The knights are even, but the rooks, white's rook is a tempo up, right? And it's going to take at least one more move with something like a6 to defend the a pawn before the rook moves. Otherwise, you'll drop the pawn and probably lose the game because of it. And also, the king is just one tempo down. That's just 2 tempo, but that's almost a significant advantage just in itself, and that's pretty much why the game was lost. It's not losing yet. I would like to make that clear, though. King to f1, a6, h3, just to get some luft, and also it prevents knight g4, which is also something really good to prevent. King to g8, b3 now, and that just gets a pawn off the dark squares because, well, there are dark squared bishops on the board. It's just a solid move, nothing wrong with it. Rook to d8, takes, and king to e2. And this next move, I think, is practically quite difficult for Anand. I don't think it's losing yet, but it's getting difficult. And that's the move h5. Now, h5 allows a series of moves that, to me, was quite surprising, but poses a lot of danger. And it starts with the move bishop to g5. This doesn't really make sense because, well, there's pawns on both sides of the board. It's an ending. The bishop should be better, right? Well, after king f8, king d3, and king e8, Gledura decides to take on f6. And I think this was the right call. I think practically this is already quite difficult to defend now. Instead of the move king to e8 at the end, I think maybe king e7 is unfortunately the only try for something. But that's a really depressing move to play. Because just look at the alignment, right? The knight's on f6, the king's on e7, everything feels like blocked up. But it's important that if they take on f6, you can take with the king. You just need activity because, as we see in the game, after king to e8, bishop takes f6, bishop takes to f6, and king to e4, look at the difference between the kings alone. The minor pieces don't even matter because, well, the king is actually the most valuable piece in an ending. If we look at something like the bishops or the knights, the bishop's worth like 3.25 pawns. The knight is worth 3. Of course, there are circumstances where that is different. And the kings are actually considered to be worth about 4 pawns of material because of the way they move. So bishop d8 was played, knight e5. So king d5 wasn't played quite yet because of bishop to b6. And you have to block with knight d4 to keep the pawn. So they, Gledura, not they, played knight to e5 here. And this just allows something like f3 or knight to d3. King to e7, and now king to d5. You can just get to that square anyway, so might as well not drop the f2 pawn. Probably a good idea. That's why they're a grandmaster and we're not, right? So bishop to b6, and now knight to d3. So he didn't feel like moving the pawn. He probably could have, but knight to d3 is just as good. And it also has a potential threat of something we'll see in just the move. So king to d7, And now it's the move. This is the third time I was kind of surprised by this game, and I think at this point it's already winning. And it's really hard to see where black went wrong because it just doesn't feel like they did. The only things we could argue that felt like time wasters was this h5 move and also this king e8 move when they should have played king e7 for activity. Knight c5 was played, and I think it's already lost. The king and pawn ending is for sure lost, but it's hard to calculate, and Anand did go into it with bishop takes c5. So let's look at the resulting game and see how it played out. King takes c5, king c7, h4, king to d7, king to b6, king to c8, b4, king to b8, and now f3. So this prepares a potential g4, king c8, and now g4. And white's pawns are just a little bit quicker here. After h takes, f takes, and king b8, h5 was played, f6, and it feels like, okay, well, we can't make progress on the king side anymore, but that's where now the queen side comes into play. a4, principle, kind of like two weaknesses, not quite, but the thing is, if you can get a passed pawn on the queen side, you can just like give it up and just go for the king side, so it's good to have those pawns advanced as well for that reason. King to c8, and now king to a7, king c7, and b5, and now it's just over. If you take on b5, it's just a zugzwang already, b6 and just king a6, and this is not necessarily winning. I think this is winning regardless. So for example, king c6, king c8, push, and then push, right? But even if it weren't winning somehow, if you could not win by force with the pawn on this side of the board, it doesn't even matter. You don't even have to think about knowing this position's correct and winning, because you could also just go to the other side of the board, and they're just too slow, as we can see. Although luckily you can still win on the left side of the board there. So let's go all the way back here. So you can't take the pawn, and after a5, there's this move king a8, which puts black in zugzwang again. If king c8, there's b6, which is an incredible move, and now you don't have king to c7. And of course, if you go b6 as black, then king back to a7, and it's just like if b6 were played, except it's just one square down the board, closer to the first rank instead of the 8th rank. But either way, this king and pawn endgame is just completely losing from the start, and it just felt like black did nothing wrong this game. But we can kind of count 2 reasons why this didn't work out for black. Actually, maybe even 3. First, it was the tempi, right? The king was on h8. If we go all the way back here, the king was on h8 and had to waste time to just go back to g8. That was like not a mistake from black. That was just a little thing that was added. But then h5 made things really difficult, where one set of minor pieces were able to be traded off, and the advantage grew because of it, because light squares weren't able to be covered after the knight was taken, because, well, as we can see here, the knight does cover both color squares, and the bishop can only cover the dark squares. And as we see with the king on d5, it wouldn't be able to be there if there was a knight on f6. So that's one of the reasons. The last reason I think that this game kind of went poorly is, again, I think maybe it is holdable after the move king e7. Again, a very ugly move though, and it feels somewhat unpractical to find. And don't worry if something like knight d4, there is the move g6, which protects everything, even though, again, it is very ugly. But that is Gledura Anand. I hope you guys enjoyed the game, and thank you for watching. Have a good one. Bye-bye.